In the summer of 1941, British Lieutenant David Stirling shimmied under a perimeter fence, attempting to break into his own country's army base in Cairo, Egypt. He'd recently shattered his spine, attempting an insane parachute jump using a ripcord tied to a chair leg. Now, the 6'6" Stirling, nicknamed the Giant Sloth, was conducting his seemingly absurd mission on crutches. Tucked under his arm, a wild idea for a secret new special ops unit written down on toilet paper. He had only seconds to find someone willing to read it. Stirling's toilet paper was either going to be the most reckless proposal of World War II, or change the way war was fought forever. David Stirling was born into everything: wealth, aristocracy, a sprawling Scottish estate, and a military heritage that stretched back generations. His father was a brigadier general. His mother was descended from King Charles II. By all accounts, young David should have been destined for greatness. Instead, he became a professional disappointment. At Cambridge University, he racked up 28 violations in his first year alone. When the master of the college finally expelled him, he mercifully asked Stirling to select just 3 offenses that would be, quote, least offensive to his mother. Stirling then tried his hand as an artist in Paris. That didn't work out either. In 1937, he was commissioned into the Scots Guards as a reservist, his family's military heritage demanding at least a token gesture towards service. But even that couldn't hold his attention. He drifted to the U.S., working as a ranch hand in Montana, gambling, drinking, and generally avoiding anything resembling responsibility. Standing 6 feet 6 inches tall, but moving with all the urgency of a man underwater, Stirling earned a reputation that followed him everywhere. Friends called him the Great Sloth. It wasn't meant as a compliment. When World War II broke out in September 1939, Stirling was still in Montana. He sailed home on the SS Manhattan, rejoining the Scots Guards. But the early months of war brought more drilling and waiting than actual fighting. The endless training and regimental discipline bored him to tears. In June 1940, aged 24, and both desperate for action and allergic to routine, he volunteered for the newly formed No. 8 Commando under Lieutenant Colonel Robert Laycock. In February 1941, his commando unit, now called Lay Force, sailed for the Middle East to support operations in North Africa and the Mediterranean. However, while other Lay Force units saw action at Crete and the Litani River, Stirling's operations were repeatedly cancelled. He was still not given a chance to prove himself on the front lines. Frustrated, Stirling slipped back into his old ways, narrowly avoiding a court-martial for malingering. One superior officer's report summarized Stirling as, quote, irresponsible and unremarkable. After suffering heavy losses, Lay Force was disbanded within a few months. Having spent over a year in uniform without firing a shot in anger, Stirling found himself in Cairo, bored and directionless once again. But that summer, he would cross paths with another former member of Lay Force, Lieutenant John Jock Lewes, a capable and highly disciplined Welshman. He and Stirling immediately hit it off. Despite neither of them having any formal training, the two men decided to attempt the Middle East's first parachute jump. Stirling simply strapped on a parachute, tied the ripcord to the leg of a chair inside a completely unsuitable aircraft, and jumped. Years later, he would recall with characteristic understatement, quote, I was a bit unlucky because my parachute, when it opened, was attached to the tailplane. Before it broke loose, it took off a panel or two of the parachute. I descended a good deal faster than my companion. He plummeted to earth, slamming into the desert with devastating force. The impact shattered his spine. Doctors told him he might never walk again. For 2 months, his legs remained paralyzed. Yet lying in that Cairo hospital bed, unable to move, the giant sloth's mind finally started working. He spent months watching commandos train for operations that never happened, seeing good men wasted on bureaucratic indecision. The Desert War was being lost because the British were fighting the wrong way. Massive formations, grinding against German armor in predictable patterns. But what if you could slip small teams behind enemy lines, parachute them into the deep desert, attack the Axis airfields where Rommel's Luftwaffe sat vulnerable on the ground, then vanish back into the sand before anyone knew what hit them? Forget the conventional wisdom about needing hundreds of men. 5 or 6 trained soldiers could destroy more aircraft in one night than a bombing squadron could in a week. Working with his brother, Bill, based in Cairo with the Special Operations Executive at the time, Stirling scribbled furiously on whatever paper he could find, including, according to legend, toilet paper. They wrote a memo outlining a radical proposal, a new unit operating independently, built on speed, surprise, and small numbers. However, David Stirling knew exactly what would happen if he submitted it through the proper channels. It would get buried by Middle East headquarters' middle-ranking officers who were notoriously terrified of innovation. Stirling later described them as, quote, unfailingly obstructive and uncooperative, astonishingly tiresome. He even called them, quote, fossilized shits. So Stirling came up with a daring plan that would allow him to skip the chain of command entirely and take his idea straight to the top. His chances of success were incredibly slim, but as far as he was concerned, he had nothing to lose. In July 1941, still on crutches and barely able to walk, Stirling hobbled to Middle East headquarters in Cairo. The sprawling compound was ringed with fences and guards, strictly off limits to anyone below field rank. Stirling didn't care. Accounts differ on whether he crawled under the perimeter fence, squeezed through a gap, or climbed over with his crutches, but one way or another, he made his way inside. Guards spotted him almost immediately. Stirling abandoned his crutches and limped as quickly as he could into the nearest building, his paralyzed leg screaming in protest. He burst through a door and came face to face with an officer he'd previously fallen out with. The man's eyes widened in recognition. Stirling spun around and retreated down the corridor, ducking into another office. Behind the desk sat Major General Neil Ritchie, the Deputy Chief of Staff. Before anyone could throw him out, Stirling launched into his pitch. As the young Scotsman passionately laid out his ideas, expecting to be manhandled by guards any moment, he realized something incredible. Ritchie was actually listening to him. Instead of laughing him off, the Major General picked up the phone and called General Claude Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief of Middle East Command. Within hours, Stirling had somehow gained approval to form L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade, a deliberately misleading name designed to make the Germans think Britain had an entire parachute brigade in North Africa, when in reality, Stirling would have just 66 men. The giant sloth had just talked his way into command of his own unit. Now he had to prove he could actually use it effectively. But first, he had to assemble his team. Despite significant kickback from the middle ranks at MEHQ, whose contempt for Stirling had only grown after he'd bypassed them to form what they considered to be a renegade unit, he was gradually able to recruit several other former Layforce men who were now just as bored and desperate for combat as he was, bringing together what he would describe as, quote, a band of vagabonds. One of them, Jeff de Vivier, a Londoner from the hotel trade, recalled, quote, we were just hanging around in the desert, getting fed up. Then along came Stirling, asking for volunteers. I was hooked on the idea from the beginning. It meant we were going to see some action. Among the ex-Layforce members he was able to recruit was the man whose parachute experiment had started all of this, Lieutenant Jacques Luz, who would be in charge of most of the men's military training. Another was Paddy Mayne, an Irishman, an international rugby player, who at 6 feet 4 inches was almost as tall as Stirling himself. Yet that's where their similarities ended. While Stirling was charismatic and politically savvy, Mayne had a reputation for his dual personality that could quickly lurch from politeness into extreme violence. One comrade remembered, quote, when sober, a gentler, more mild-mannered man you could not wish to meet, but when drunk or in battle, he was frightening. Legend claims that Stirling found him in the glass house, awaiting court-martial for threatening his commanding officer. The truth was slightly less dramatic. Mayne was idling at the commando base, waiting to see if his transfer request to the Far East had been approved. But within minutes of meeting Stirling, Mayne was sufficiently impressed to change his plans and pledged his allegiance to the new unit instead. He would quickly become one of the fledgling SAS's most important figures. Stirling said of his recruits, quote, they weren't really controllable. They were harassable, but they had all this individuality. The object was to give them the same purpose. They would soon be bound by a motto, personally chosen by Stirling himself. Who dares, wins. The unit's new home was Kabrit, 90 miles east of Cairo, on the edge of the Great Bitter Lake. It was desolate, just sand, flies, and relentless wind. They had nothing but basic tents. So Stirling's men did what came naturally. They stole everything they needed from a nearby New Zealand camp that had been set up for troops who'd been slaughtered at Crete instead. Furniture, tents, supplies, even a piano, all liberated in midnight raids. With the stolen bricks from an RAF base, they built themselves a canteen. By November 1941, L Detachment was ready for its first mission. The plan for Operation Squatter was simple. 5 Bristol Bombay transport aircraft would drop Stirling's 55-man team behind enemy lines to attack Axis airfields at Gazala and Tamimi. There, they would destroy Rommel's aircraft on the ground using a revolutionary new weapon designed by John Lewis, the Lewis bomb, a crude but devastating 1-pound bomb combining plastic explosive and thermite. Meanwhile, the 8th Army would launch Operation Crusader, its major offensive to retake eastern Libya. On November 15th, the day before the mission, David Stirling celebrated his 26th birthday by writing to his mother, quote, "It's the best possible type of operation and will be far more exciting than dangerous." Then the weather reports arrived. A massive storm was building over the target area. Winds of 30 knots, twice the maximum safe speed for parachuting, on a moonless night, into unfamiliar terrain. Brigadier General Sandy Galloway believed the operation would prove impossible and recommended scrubbing it. But Stirling had waited months for this chance. He gathered his men and put it to a vote. Unanimously, they chose to go. At 6:30 p.m., trucks transported them to the waiting aircraft. Jeff Duvivier recalled how he clutched his gear as he, quote, "muttered a silent prayer and put myself in God's hands." The planes took off into gathering darkness, buffeted by increasingly violent winds. Lieutenant Owen McGonagall's aircraft went first, then Stirling's, then Duvivier's. Lieutenant Charles Bodington's plane followed, and finally Paddy Maine's, 40 minutes behind schedule. As they approached the drop zones, German anti-aircraft fire exploded around them, forcing evasive maneuvers that scattered the formations even further. At 10:30 p.m., the men began jumping into hell. The storm hit with savage force. Winds grabbed the paratroopers and hurled them across the desert like rag dolls. Men were scattered across the desolate landscape, miles from their drop zones, slamming into the ground at terrifying speeds before being dragged through thorn bushes and across rocks, the wind knocked from their lungs. McGonagall lost his life after breaking his back, while Duvivier was yanked 150 yards before snagging on scrub, his body torn and bleeding. Most of the equipment containers, carrying weapons, explosives, water, and food, had parachutes that failed to open. They struck the ground like bombs, detonators exploding on impact. Sergeant John Shane vanished entirely, never to be seen again. Meanwhile, Charles Monington's aircraft never made it. It was shot down by a Messerschmitt, claiming the life of the co-pilot and injuring everyone on board before German troops captured the survivors. The remaining SAS men, at least the ones who could still move, tried desperately to find one another in the darkness. Gradually, they began to regroup and prepare to continue with their mission. But then the rain came, torrential downpours that turned wadis into rivers and rendered the time pencil fuses useless. Stirling, Lewis, and Maine all independently reached the same grim conclusion. There was simply no way they could go on. They were forced to abort and begin the long march to the rendezvous point with the long-range desert group. When the final count came in, only 21 men reached the point where they were to be picked up by the long-range desert group. 34 had either gone missing, been captured, or hadn't lived to tell the tale. Not a single enemy aircraft had been touched. Not a single SAS shot had been fired. There was no way to put a positive spin on it. The unit's first operation had been an unmitigated disaster. On the afternoon of November 25th, the battered survivors reached Jugbub Oasis. Before sending the wounded to the medical post, Stirling assembled what remained of his unit. Most commanders would have quietly dissolved L Detachment after Operation Squatter and pretended it never happened. Stirling did the opposite. Jeff Duvivier wrote in his diary that Stirling promised them, quote, a next time. Duvivier added, quote, I don't fancy a next time if this is what it's going to be like. But Stirling had already identified the fatal flaw, parachuting. The long-range desert group had delivered them safely to the rendezvous point using their trucks. Why not have the LRDG drive them all the way to their target? It would be more accurate and far more comfortable. The long-range desert group, a reconnaissance unit formed in 1940, had been operating in the deep desert for over a year. They knew how to navigate by sun and stars, how to survive on minimal water, how to move unseen through terrain the enemy considered impassable. The SAS men finally nicknamed them the Libyan Desert Taxi Service. Just 1 month after the disaster, L Detachment was ready to try again. This time, LRDG trucks carried them deep behind enemy lines. The raiders crept to within striking distance of their targets on foot, planted loose bombs on aircraft with time pencil fuses, and slipped away before the explosions began. It worked perfectly. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. The SAS would spend days being ferried across hundreds of miles of desert, lying up in wadis during daylight, then striking at night. Airfield after airfield erupted in flames. Italian and German pilots would wait to find their aircraft burning on the tarmac, unable to comprehend how the enemy had penetrated so far behind their lines. By the end of December 1941, L Detachment had destroyed 90 aircraft. Then tragedy struck. During a withdrawal, Jacques Lou's patrol was strafed by German aircraft. Lou's didn't survive the attack. The loss devastated Stirling, who'd relied heavily on Lou's tactical brilliance and iron discipline. But Paddy Mayne stepped up, channeling his grief into cold fury against the enemy. The raids continued through early 1942, growing bolder. In February, Stirling's efforts were officially recognized with the Distinguished Service Order, one of the highest awards for combat leadership in the British honor system. But the forward-thinking Scotsman was already envisioning the next evolution. That summer, he acquired a batch of American Jeeps and had them modified, armor stripped away for speed, mounted with Vickers K machine guns fore and aft. The SAS was about to become even more dangerous. The modified American Jeeps transformed everything. Now, Stirling and his men had no need to expose themselves by moving on foot. They could drive straight onto enemy airfields at night, guns blazing, and shoot up everything in sight before vanishing back into the desert. The first Jeep-borne raid came in June 1942 when Stirling's squadron hit the Italian-held Bagush airfield. They roared down the lines of parked aircraft, machine guns hammering, scattering the terrified ground crews. 2 other Axis airfields burned that same night. By dawn, Stirling was back in Cairo, collecting another shipment of Jeeps for the next raid. But the operation that cemented Stirling's legend came on the night of July 26, 1942. 18 Jeeps carrying Stirling's SAS squadron drove through the darkness toward Sidi Hanish landing strip. Intelligence reported it was heavily defended, packed with German and Italian aircraft, mostly bombers and heavy transports vital to Rommel's supply lines. The approach was grueling. Days crossing the desert, evading enemy patrols, navigating by stars. They struck at midnight. The Jeeps burst onto the airfield in 2 columns, machine guns erupting in coordinated fury. Tracer rounds arced through the darkness, igniting fuel tanks and ammunition stores. The Vickers K guns fired at 950 rounds a minute, shredding aircraft fuselages like paper. Ground crews scrambled for cover as the SAS men hurled Lou's bombs onto bombers and transports. Chaos consumed the airfield. Secondary explosions ripped across the tarmac as fuel tanks cooked off. Italian guards fired wildly into the darkness, unable to identify their attackers. The SAS jeeps wheeled through the confusion, their drivers weaving between burning wrecks, while gunners poured fire into anything that moved. 2 SAS men fell during the raid, but as Stirling led his squadron away from Sidi Hanish, 37 Axis aircraft were blazing behind them. It was the single most devastating Special Forces raid of the entire North African campaign, and it had only taken 15 minutes. The hits kept coming. Aircraft, vehicles, railways, telecommunications, supply dumps. Nothing was safe from Stirling's SAS. With the mysterious raiders striking anywhere, anytime, always vanishing before reinforcements arrived, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel dubbed Stirling the Phantom Major. The nickname captured everything Stirling had become: elusive, terrifying, seemingly unstoppable. In August 1942, Stirling was summoned to Cairo. Winston Churchill wanted to meet the young officer everyone was talking about, not least his own son, Randolph, who had joined the SAS that April. The Prime Minister was thoroughly charmed by Stirling's audacity, but there was business too. General Bernard Montgomery was planning a major offensive from El Alamein and had a job for the SAS: raid Benghazi Harbor, where Rommel's supply convoys were landing. A simultaneous force were hit Tobruk. Stirling was horrified. The plan, codenamed Operation Bigamy, involved 200 men, elements of Middle East Commando, the Special Boat Section, and even 2 Honey tanks for extra firepower. It was everything the SAS wasn't supposed to be: large, cumbersome, predictable. It reminded him of the disastrous operations attempted by the doomed Lay Force. But Middle East headquarters insisted, and Stirling reluctantly began preparations for the raid, scheduled for September 13th. That night, the massive column advanced on Benghazi under cover of darkness. Stirling and his men, dressed as German soldiers, approached the entrance to the city. confident that their disguises would allow them to get close without attracting attention. But it wasn't meant to be. The Axis forces had caught wind of the Allies' plan and opened fire as soon as they saw them. Stirling's men were forced to withdraw in chaos toward a distant escarpment, vehicles racing across open desert. Dawn caught dozens of them still exposed. Italian aircraft descended like vultures, machine-gunning the helpless trucks. Nearly 70 vehicles were destroyed. When Stirling got word that the Tobruk raid had also ended in disaster, he was angry, but not surprised. He wrote, quote, "It was a sharp lesson, which confirmed my previous views on the error of attacking strategical targets on a tactical scale." Fortunately for Stirling, the failure of the operation did not affect his reputation or that of his unit. On September 28th, just 2 weeks after the debacle, L Detachment was upgraded to regimental status, becoming the first Special Air Service Regiment, and Stirling was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel at just 27 years old. Even the notoriously difficult Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had developed a soft spot for Stirling, despite his eccentric methods. In November, he remarked, quote, "The boy Stirling is quite mad. Quite mad. However, in a war, there is often a place for mad people." By January 1943, Stirling was planning another raid in southern Tunisia. Brigadier George Davey warned him he was pushing too close to concentrated enemy positions, but Stirling dismissed the advice. On January 23rd, his patrol reached a wadi, one of the few places they could hide their vehicles. They'd driven through the previous night, and the men were exhausted. Stirling posted guards, and the rest collapsed into sleep. They were unaware that they were being tracked by Hauptmann Scherer's Fallschirmjäger Company 250. The German paratroopers had followed the SAS commandos to this exact wadi, then positioned motorized infantry with heavy machine guns to seal the escape routes. In the afternoon heat, with the guards drowsy from exhaustion, the Germans struck. They found the SAS men sleeping in holes beside the dry riverbed. Some commandos jolted awake and returned fire. Others fled into the desert, but most, caught completely by surprise, were captured within minutes. Among the prisoners was a man the Germans immediately recognized as the leader. His bearing was unmistakably that of an officer, despite being dressed a little differently from his men. Tired and exhausted, but still every inch a gentleman. The Germans would soon realize they'd captured the Phantom Major himself. Stirling escaped from his German captors almost immediately, but within hours he was recaptured by the Italians, who were reported to have taken gleeful pleasure in the embarrassment this caused their German allies. The SAS leader was flown to Rome for interrogation. There, he met a fellow British prisoner, Captain John Richards, and the two struck up a conversation. Stirling talked freely about current SAS operations, patrol locations, and even naming Paddy Mayne as his probable replacement as commander. What Stirling didn't know was that Richards was actually Theodor Schurk, an Anglo-Swiss deserter who was now working for the Italians. Every word Stirling said was reported to enemy intelligence. British authorities would later discover this through intercepted signals, but the damage was done. Tragically, the same overconfidence that had made him storm Middle East HQ on crutches had made him careless with his own people's safety. Nevertheless, some of Stirling's most positive qualities also shone through during his time in captivity, most notably his stubborn refusal to give up. By February 1943, he'd been moved to Gavi, a 1,000-year-old castle encased in a 17th century fortress known as the Italian Colditz. It was reserved for the most dangerous and insubordinate Allied prisoners, particularly those who already had a track record of escape attempts. The Italians were sure it would be impossible for them to escape Gavi. After all, no one had successfully done so in over 800 years. Yet that wouldn't stop the POWs from trying. For months before Stirling's arrival, Allied prisoners, many of them experienced escape artists, had been sinking a 60-foot shaft through the ancient cistern, then digging a 30-foot horizontal tunnel through solid bedrock. The work was agonizing, chipping away stone with improvised tools, hauling debris bucket by bucket, working in shifts to avoid detection. But by the time Stirling was transferred to Gavi, the tunnel was already 3/4 complete. The prisoners were familiar with Stirling's exploits and realized how important he was to the war effort. Colonel Fraser, the senior British officer, decided to make him a priority, explaining, quote, "The most valuable service we could render would be to return David to England." Stirling would go first, along with Captain Alistair Cram and Lieutenant Jack Pringle. If they made it through the tunnel and past the guards' quarters, they'd walk over the Ligurian Alps into Switzerland. With the tunnel ready, All the prisoners had to do was wait for the perfect weather conditions. Finally, on the night of April 20th, storm clouds rolled over Gavi, hugging the fortress and reducing visibility to almost nothing. The escape was on. Stirling, Cram, and Pringle descended into the ancient cistern, then plunged into freezing water. The three men swam through the darkness, the length of the entire lower courtyard, before hauling themselves out through the tunnel. Cram went first, successfully making his way out of the complex, despite breaking 2 ribs after falling 30 feet when his makeshift rope broke. Stirling was next, but his height became a liability. He struggled through the narrow tunnel, his massive frame scraping against stone. At the exit, he became hopelessly entangled in barbed wire, thrashing to free himself while precious minutes ticked away. Eventually breaking loose, he climbed gingerly over the roof of the guard's accommodation, down the wall, and ran for a nearby olive tree. Just as he reached it, guards poured out of their quarters. They'd seen him. After a brief struggle, Stirling was dragged back inside. His dreams of freedom would have to wait. Meanwhile, Pringle reached Lago Maggiore, just 5 miles from the Swiss border, before Italian soldiers found him sleeping, utterly exhausted, under a rhododendron bush. Cram was also recaptured within days of leaving Gavi. Despite his failure, Stirling continued plotting inventive ways to break out of prison, but none were successful. A glimmer of hope came in September 1943. Italy's decision to change sides left many Allied POWs free. Yet for Stirling, and many others imprisoned in the north of the country, their situation would become even worse than before. Most camps were captured by the Germans, who were much stricter and more ruthless than their Italian predecessors had been. By August 1944, they'd had enough of Stirling's persistent efforts to escape. He'd almost made it out of the Italian Colditz, but there was no way he'd be able to break out of the real thing. Nevertheless, Stirling would excel at leading resistance within the prison in other ways. Soon after his arrival at the notorious Clifftop Castle, reserved for the most incorrigible Allied prisoners, he was appointed to set up the Colditz British Intelligence Unit. The objectives were to map the German presence in the area, Party, Army, Gestapo, SS, and identify weak spots. Through a carefully constructed network that included sympathetic locals and even some of the prison guards, Stirling's team was able to compile detailed dossiers on local officials and map the town's key installations, marking garages, petrol stores, food supplies, medical facilities, everything needed if prisoners had to take over the town. Soon, Stirling's operation grew even more audacious. His team gained access to the Kommandantur's files and switchboard, receiving telephone messages before they reached German officers. They established an early warning system using coded signals. An agent in town would walk specific patterns on streets visible from castle windows, each movement signaling different levels of danger. In one spectacular gambit, they sent an anonymous letter in perfect German to the Gauleiter of Dresden, the most powerful Nazi in the region, threatening him and making him suspect it came from the wanted Karl Gordeler, leader of the failed July 1944 plot against Hitler. In May 1945, as Germany collapsed, the intelligence network's early warning system tracked the approach of American forces as they advanced toward Colditz. The castle was liberated on May 16th. After more than 2 years behind bars, David Stirling was finally free. Stirling retired from active service in 1947 with the rank of colonel. He was appointed an officer of the Order of the British Empire for his wartime service and transferred to the regular Army Reserve of officers. Yet he would never lose his taste for adventure. The following decades saw him leading political movements in southern Africa, forming private military companies, brokering arms deals between Britain and its Middle Eastern allies, allegedly participating in a 1970 plot to overthrow Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, and even leading a controversial secret organization that prepared to take over Britain in case of civil breakdown. In 1990, Stirling was appointed a Knight Bachelor for services to the military, but he passed away in November that year at the age of 74. Meanwhile, the unit he had played an important role in establishing, the SAS, had become one of the world's most elite military units. Upon his capture in 1943, command had been taken over by Paddy Mayne, who led the first SAS through Italy and into northwest Europe with devastating effectiveness. Stirling's brother, Bill, commanded the 2nd SAS Regiment. Together, they expanded the SAS across Europe, operating alongside the French resistance and conducting operations that vindicated everything Stirling had envisioned in that Cairo hospital bed. After the war, The SAS continued to evolve, conducting operations around the globe and cementing its reputation as the premier special forces unit. The principles Stirling had championed, small teams, speed, surprise, operating behind enemy lines, became the template for special forces worldwide. The man once written off as a perennial underachiever had ended up revolutionizing the face of modern warfare.